In the quiet village of Chipping Barnet, a midnight knock at Gossington Hall heralds danger. A young woman, claiming to be a merchant's daughter fleeing highwaymen, seeks refuge with Mrs. Lavinia Bantry. But as silver vanishes and shadows lurk, Miss Jane Marple's keen eye unravels a web of deception. Is Clara Henshaw a victim or a cunning thief? With thefts mounting and a mysterious name, Roderick Vale, emerging, Marple sets a trap to catch a criminal. In a village where trust is tested, one spinster's quiet wisdom unveils a chilling truth. Will justice prevail before the next crime strikes? Chapter 1. The Unexpected Guest. The autumn night hung heavy over Chipping Barnet, a village tucked into the gentle folds of the English countryside, where the air carried the faint scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Gossington Hall, its grey stone facade softened by moonlight, stood as the grandest residence in the village, its tall windows reflecting the quiet dignity of a world that moved at a measured pace. Mrs. Lavinia Bantry, widowed these 5 years since Colonel Arthur Bantry's passing, presided over the hall with a blend of gracious hospitality and an unerring sense of propriety. Her days were filled with the small rituals of country life, managing the household, tending the gardens, and hosting gatherings that drew the county's most respectable families. Yet, on this particular night, as the clock in the hall struck 12 with a sonorous chime, an event unfolded that would disturb the serene order of her world. Mrs. Bantry had retired early, her mind lulled by a volume of Trollope and the warmth of her fire. She was not a woman given to nerves, but the sudden sound of knocking at the great oak door startled her awake. The noise was faint at first, almost swallowed by the wind that rustled the ivy against the walls, but it grew insistent, a sharp rap that spoke of urgency. She sat up, her heart quickening. The servants were abed, and the village was a good half-mile away. Who could be calling at such an hour? Slipping into her dressing gown, a sensible garment of deep blue wool, she lit a candle and descended the grand staircase, its polished banister gleaming in the flickering light. The knocking ceased as she approached, replaced by an eerie silence that made the creak of the floorboards underfoot seem unnaturally loud. With a steadying breath, she unbolted the door and opened it to reveal a figure standing in the shadowed portico. A young woman, no more than 25, her face pale as the moonlight that framed her. "Good heavens!" Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, her voice a mixture of surprise and concern. "Who are you, and what brings you here at this hour?" The stranger's dark hair was dishevelled, clinging damply to her cheeks, and her cloak, though of good quality, was mud-stained at the hem. Her eyes, wide and dark, held a flicker of fear, though her voice was steady as she spoke. "My name is Clara Henshaw," she said, her words clipped with the precision of one accustomed to being heard. "I beg your pardon for the intrusion, but I am in great distress. I was travelling by carriage when it was set upon by brigands. I fled and wandered until I saw your lights. Please, may I find shelter here?" Mrs. Bantry hesitated, her practical nature warring with her compassion. The girl's story was plausible. Highwaymen, though less common now, were not unheard of on the lonely roads beyond Chipping Barnet. Yet there was something in Clara's bearing, a certain polish that belied her tale of desperation, that gave Mrs. Bantry pause. Still, the night was cold, and the hall was large. "Come in," she said at last, stepping aside. "You shall have a room and something warm to drink. We can sort this out in the morning." Clara murmured her thanks, her eyes darting about the hall as she entered, taking in the portraits of stern-faced Bantrys and the gleam of polished silver on the sideboard. Mrs. Bantry led her to the drawing-room, where she stoked the embers of the fire, and rang for Mary, the maid, who appeared bleary-eyed but obedient. A guest-room was prepared, and Clara was given a cup of tea laced with a touch of brandy. She drank it slowly, her hands trembling slightly, though whether from cold or nerves, Mrs. Bantry could not tell. By morning, the village was alive with whispers of the midnight visitor. News travelled swiftly in Chipping Barnet, carried by servants' gossip and the chatter of early risers at the bakery. At the vicarage, where Miss Jane Marple was taking tea with the vicar's wife, the tale was recounted with relish. Miss Marple, a slight figure with snow-white hair, and a face that seemed perpetually poised between curiosity and serenity, listened with her usual attentiveness. Her hands, delicate but sure, moved deftly with her knitting, the soft click of the needles a counterpoint to the vicar's wife's animated narrative. "A young woman quite alone and at midnight!" Mrs. Clements exclaimed, her eyes bright with the thrill of it. "Lavinia says she's a merchant's daughter from London, but I declare there's something queer about it. Highwaymen, indeed! We've not had such trouble here since old Mr. Grayson's coach was robbed 20 years ago." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "How very curious," she said softly, her voice carrying that gentle cadence that often disarmed those who underestimated her. "A merchant's daughter, you say? And she came to Gossington Hall by chance?" Her tone was mild, but her eyes, sharp and clear behind her spectacles, betrayed a mind already sifting through possibilities. She had known many such stories in her long life, tales of distress that masked other motives, of strangers who were not quite strangers. As she sipped her tea, she resolved to pay a visit to Gossington Hall. There was, she felt, more to Clara Henshaw than met the eye. Chapter 2. The Tale of Clara. Sheer Henshaw. The morning sun filtered through the heavy drapes of Gossington Hall, casting long shadows across the polished oak floors of the dining room. Mrs. Lavinia Bantry, ever the gracious hostess, had insisted on a proper breakfast despite the unsettling events of the previous night. The table was set with crisp linen, gleaming silver, and a spread of kedgeree, toast and marmalade, though the air held a tension that no amount of domestic order could dispel. Clara Henshaw, the unexpected guest, sat opposite Mrs. Bantry, her dark hair now neatly pinned, and her borrowed dress, a simple but elegant frock from Mrs. Bantry's own wardrobe, lending her an air of respectability. Yet her pale complexion and the faint tremor in her hands as she lifted her teacup suggested that her composure was a fragile veneer. Miss Jane Marple had been invited to luncheon, a decision Mrs. Bantry made with the instinct of one who knew the value of a sharp mind in times of uncertainty. Miss Marple arrived promptly at noon, her slight figure wrapped in a tweed coat, her eyes bright with that quiet curiosity that had unravelled many a village mystery. She took her seat at the table, her knitting bag placed discreetly at her feet, and surveyed the scene with the air of one accustomed to noticing what others overlooked. The other guests included Dr. Haydock, the village physician, whose gruff manner concealed a keen intellect, and Mrs. Clements, the vicar's wife, whose enthusiasm for gossip was matched only by her devotion to the church flower rota. Mrs. Bantry, with her characteristic directness, introduced Clara to the group. "Miss Henshaw arrived quite unexpectedly last night," she explained, her tone carefully neutral. "She has had a most distressing experience, and I thought it only right to offer her shelter." She gestured to Clara, who inclined her head with a small, grateful smile. At Mrs. Bantry's prompting, Clara began her tale. Her voice, clear and measured, carried the cadence of one who had rehearsed her words. "I am the daughter of a London merchant, Mr. Thomas Henshaw, who passed away some months ago," she said, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth as if to avoid scrutiny. "He left me a modest inheritance, enough to secure my future, and I was travelling to visit a cousin in Gloucestershire when my carriage was set upon by two masked men. They demanded my valuables, but I had little to give. In the confusion, I fled into the night, running through fields and lanes until I saw the lights of Gossington Hall. I owe Mrs. Bantry my deepest gratitude for her kindness. The story, though dramatic, was delivered with a curious detachment, as if Clara were reciting a part, rather than reliving a trauma. Dr. Haydock, who had seen many a patient in distress, raised an eyebrow but said nothing, his fork pausing over his kedgeree. Mrs. Clements, however, was all sympathy, her hands clasped in dismay. "Oh, you poor dear! Highwaymen, in this day and age! It's positively medieval! And to think you wandered alone in the dark! What a mercy you found your way here!" Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly, listened with an air of polite interest, but her mind was elsewhere. She noted the smoothness of Clara's hands, unmarked by the toil one might expect of a merchant's daughter, and the way her accent, though refined, carried a faint trace of something less provincial, perhaps the Polish of a finishing school, or the studied mimicry of one who had learned to adapt. The story, Miss Marple reflected, was plausible enough, yet it lacked the ragged edges of truth. She recalled a young woman from her youth, a governess who had spun a similar tale of misfortune to gain entry to a household, only to be unmasked as a thief's accomplice. "A most distressing ordeal," Miss Marple said mildly, her eyes meeting Clara's for a fleeting moment. "You must have been terribly frightened." Clara nodded, her gaze dropping to her plate. "I was, indeed. I scarcely knew where I was running, only that I had to escape." The conversation turned to village matters, but Miss Marple's attention remained on Clara. She observed the young woman's quick glances toward the windows, as if expecting someone or something to appear. When Mrs. Bantry excused herself to speak with the housekeeper, Miss Marple took the opportunity to engage Clara further. "Your father's business, Miss Henshaw," she said, her tone as gentle as a summer breeze. "Was it in trade or commerce? I have a cousin in London who deals in textiles, and I'm always curious about such matters." Clara hesitated, her fingers tightening around her napkin. "Oh, it was a small concern. Importing teas and spices mostly, nothing grand." The answer was vague, and Miss Marple noted the slight flush that crept into Clara's cheeks. She did not press further, but the seed of suspicion was firmly planted. After luncheon, as the guests dispersed, Mrs. Bantry's maid, Mary, approached Miss Marple with a conspiratorial air. "Begging your pardon, miss," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder to ensure Clara was out of earshot, "but I found something in the guest room while tidying. It was tucked under the mattress, a scrap of paper with a name and address." She handed Miss Marple a crumpled piece of paper, torn at the edges, bearing the words "Roderick Vale, 17 Cutler Street, London." Miss Marple thanked Mary, her expression unchanging, but her mind was alight with possibilities. The name meant nothing to her, but the carelessness of leaving such a clue suggested either desperation or inexperience. She slipped the paper into her reticule, resolving to make discreet inquiries. As she walked back to her cottage, the autumn leaves crunching underfoot, she reflected on the nature of stories. "People are so careless with their lives," she mused to herself. "They forget that the smallest detail can betray them." That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the post office, where the postmistress, Miss Weatherby, was a font of local knowledge. With a few well-placed questions, posed with her usual air of innocent curiosity, Miss Marple learned that a letter addressed to Roderick Vale had been sent from Chipping Barnet only 3 days prior. Miss Weatherby, eager to share, added that Vale was rumoured to be a gentleman of questionable character, known in London for his associations with gaming houses and less reputable circles. "Not the sort one expects in Chipping Barnet," she said, her lips pursed in disapproval. Returning to her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting a steady rhythm as she turned the facts over in her mind. Clara's polished manners, her vague answers, the scrap of paper, and now this connection to a dubious figure in London. It all pointed to a narrative far more intricate than a simple tale of highwaymen. She thought of a case from years ago, when a young woman had arrived in a neighbouring village with a similar story, only to be revealed as a distraction for a gang of burglars. Human nature, Miss Marple murmured, is so very predictable. As the evening drew in, she resolved to keep a close watch on Clara Henshaw. The young woman's story, she felt, was only the opening chapter of a much larger mystery, one that Gossington Hall, and perhaps all of Chipping Barnet, would soon feel the weight of. Chapter 3. The shadow of suspicion, the tranquil rhythm of Chipping Barnet, ordinarily marked by the tolling of the church bell and the chatter of market day, had been disrupted by a series of disquieting events that followed Clara Henshaw's arrival at Gossington Hall. By the third morning of her stay, the village was abuzz with more than just curiosity about the stranger. A silver candelabrum, an heirloom of considerable value, had vanished from the vicarage, its absence discovered when Mrs. Clements arrived to arrange flowers for Sunday service. That same day, Mr. Tompkins, a stout farmer known for his prize-winning livestock, reported the theft of a fine bay mare from his stable. The mare, a spirited creature named Willow, was the pride of his fields, and its loss sent ripples of unease through the community. Whispers of a shadowy figure seen near the village green. After dusk only deepened the sense of disquiet. Old Mrs. Hargreaves, who kept a vigilant watch from her cottage window, swore she had seen a man in a dark coat lingering by the hedgerows, though her account was dismissed by some as the fancy of an aging spinster. Yet the coincidence of these incidents with Clara's arrival was not lost on the villagers, and suspicion, like a creeping fog, began to settle over Gossington Hall. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her small parlour with a cup of tea and her ever-present knitting, listened to the latest reports with her characteristic calm. Her cottage, a modest affair with roses climbing the walls, was a haven of order, its shelves lined with books and its windows offering a clear view of the village lane. Mrs. Bantry had called that morning, her face flushed with a mixture of indignation and worry. "Jane, I don't know what to think," she confessed, settling into a chintz-covered chair. "Clara seems a perfect lady, but these thefts, and that man near the green, could she be involved? I feel such a fool for taking her in." Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, softened with sympathy. "My dear Lavinia, you acted with kindness, as you always do," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "But it is wise to be cautious. People are not always what they seem, and a stranger's arrival often stirs the waters." She paused, her needles pausing mid-stitch. "Tell me, has Clara said anything more about her plans? Does she intend to stay long?" Mrs. Bantry shook her head. "She speaks of leaving soon, to continue her journey to her cousin, but she's vague about the details. I pressed her yesterday about writing to this cousin, and she grew quite flustered, said the address was lost in her flight. It's odd, Jane, don't you think?" "Very odd," Miss Marple agreed, her tone mild, but her mind racing. The scrap of paper bearing the name Roderick Vale, now tucked safely in her reticule, loomed large in her thoughts. She had not yet shared this discovery with Mrs. Bantry, preferring to gather more threads before weaving them into a pattern. Perhaps, she suggested, you might invite Clara to join us for tea tomorrow. A little company often loosens the tongue. Mrs. Bantry nodded, reassured by Miss Marple's quiet confidence, and took her leave. Alone again, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her thoughts turning to the village's recent troubles. The candelabrum, the mare, the shadowy figure, these were not random acts, she felt certain. They bore the mark of calculation, of a plan set in motion by someone who knew the value of distraction. She recalled a case from years past, in a village not unlike Chipping Barnet, where a series of petty thefts had masked a larger crime. The trick, she murmured to herself, is to look beyond the surface to the shadows where the truth hides. That afternoon, Miss Marple took her customary walk through the village, her sensible shoes tapping lightly on the cobbled path. She paused at the blacksmith's forge, where Mr. Tompkins was recounting the theft of his mare to a small crowd. "Gone without a trace," he said, his voice thick with frustration. "The gate was latched, the stable locked, whoever took her knew their business." Miss Marple listened, her head tilted slightly, and then asked with her usual diffidence whether he had noticed anything unusual in the days prior. Tompkins scratched his head, then mentioned a stranger, a man in a dark coat, seen near his fields the evening before the theft. "Didn't think much of it then," he admitted, "but now, I wonder." At the general store, Miss Marple lingered over a display of ribbons, chatting with the shopkeeper, Mr. Pym, whose ear for gossip rivaled even Miss Weatherby's. He confided that a letter had arrived that morning, addressed to Mrs. Bantry, but marked with a London postmark and an unfamiliar hand. "Looked official-like," he said, lowering his voice. "I gave it to her maid to deliver. Queer, ain't it, with all this talk of strangers?" Miss Marple thanked him, her mind noting the detail. A letter from London, so soon after Clara's arrival, suggested a connection that could not be ignored. She made her way to the churchyard, where she found Mrs. Clements arranging chrysanthemums with a distracted air. The vicar's wife was eager to share her own suspicions. "That candelabrum was locked in a cupboard," she said, her voice trembling with indignation. "Someone must have known exactly where to look. And I heard from Mrs. Hargreaves about that man by the green. Oh, Miss Marple, do you think we're dealing with a gang?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "It is possible," she said, "but we must not leap to conclusions. A single thread can lead to many knots." She did not mention Roderick Vale, though the name weighed heavily on her. Instead, she steered the conversation to Clara, asking whether the young woman had visited the vicarage. Mrs. Clements shook her head. "Not yet, though Lavinia says she's been asking about the village, who lives where, who keeps what. I thought it odd for someone just passing through." As Miss Marple walked home, the autumn sun dipping low, she pieced together the fragments. Clara's vague story, the thefts, the man in the dark coat, the letter from London, and the name Roderick Vale, all pointed to a scheme that was both bold and calculated. She thought of a young couple she had known in her youth, who had used charm and sob stories to infiltrate homes, only to rob them blind. The pattern is familiar, she mused, but the players are new. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit a lamp and sat by the fire, her knitting a steady rhythm. She resolved to attend Mrs. Bantry's tea the next day, where she could observe Clara more closely. The young woman's polished manners and nervous glances suggested a story yet to be told, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover it. Suspicion, she thought, is a delicate thing. Too much, and it blinds you. Too little, and it betrays you. With that, she turned her attention to her knitting, the click of her needles a quiet promise that the truth, however well hidden, would not elude her for long. Chapter 4. The arrival of Inspector Craddock. The crisp air of Chipping Barnet carried a faint chill as the village settled into the rhythm of late morning, but the undercurrent of unease persisted, fueled by the recent thefts and the mysterious presence of Clara Henshaw at Gossington Hall. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her small writing desk, was penning a note to her nephew, Raymond West, when the sound of a motor car rumbled down the lane. Peering through her lace curtains, she saw the unmistakable outline of a police vehicle pulling up outside the post office. Her lips curved into a faint smile. "Authority has arrived," she murmured, setting her pen aside. She had anticipated that the local constable, overwhelmed by the theft of the vicarage candelabrum and Mr. Tompkins' mare, would summon reinforcements. By noon, the village was abuzz with the news that Detective Inspector Craddock, a young but seasoned officer from Scotland Yard, had taken up residence at the Blue Boar Inn. Craddock, with his sharp features and brisk manner, was no stranger to Chipping Barnet, having assisted in a case some years prior, a fact that Miss Marple recalled with quiet satisfaction. She had found him to be a man of intelligence, open to insights from unexpected quarters, which suited her purposes admirably. Mrs. Bantry, eager to share the latest developments, invited Miss Marple to Gossington Hall for tea that afternoon, where Inspector Craddock was expected to call. As Miss Marple arrived, her tweed coat dusted with the first fallen leaves of the season, she found the drawing-room a scene of restrained tension. Clara Henshaw sat by the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Mrs. Bantry, resplendent in a plum-coloured dress, was attempting to maintain her usual composure, but her frequent glances toward Clara suggested a growing disquiet. Inspector Craddock entered with a polite nod, his notebook in hand, and his expression one of professional detachment. After exchanging pleasantries, he turned his attention to Clara, who had risen to greet him with a smile that was just a shade too bright. "Miss Henshaw," he began, his tone measured, "I understand you arrived under rather dramatic circumstances. Could you recount your story for me, please?" Clara repeated her tale of the highwayman, her voice steady but her fingers twisting the edge of her borrowed shawl. She spoke of her father, the late merchant, and her flight through the night, her words almost identical to those she had shared at luncheon. Inspector Craddock listened intently, jotting notes, but Miss Marple, seated quietly with her knitting, noted the slight tightening of his jaw when Clara mentioned the masked men. It was clear he found her story, if not implausible, then certainly convenient. When Clara finished, Craddock leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Miss Henshaw, your description: dark hair, slight build, approximately 25, bears a striking resemblance to a woman seen in London recently, in the company of a known thief. Can you account for your movements in the days before your journey?" Clara's composure faltered, her cheeks paling. I was in London, of course, settling my father's affairs," she stammered. "But I assure you I know no thieves. I am a respectable woman, Inspector." Her indignation was convincing, but Miss Marple, watching closely, observed the way Clara's gaze darted to the door, as if calculating the distance to freedom. Mrs. Bantry, visibly uncomfortable, interjected, "Surely, Inspector, you don't suspect Miss Henshaw of any wrongdoing? She came to us in distress, and I've seen nothing to suggest she's anything but a victim." Craddock offered a reassuring smile. "I suspect no one, Mrs. Bantry, but I must follow every lead. The thefts in the village are serious, and the timing of Miss Henshaw's arrival raises questions." He turned back to Clara. "Have you any connections in London who might vouch for you? A friend, perhaps, or a business associate of your father's?" Clara hesitated, then shook her head. "My father's associates are scattered, and I've been much alone since his death. I can provide names, but they may be difficult to trace." Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly, chose that moment to speak. "Inspector," she said, her voice gentle, but carrying that quiet authority that commanded attention, "I wonder if you've heard of a gentleman named Roderick Vale. I understand he is known in certain London circles." She did not mention the scrap of paper, but her eyes met Craddock's with a knowing glint. The inspector's brow furrowed. "Vale, the name is familiar. A man of questionable reputation, if I recall, linked to petty thefts and gambling debts. Do you believe he's connected to this matter, Miss Marple?" "Oh, I believe nothing," she replied, her tone disarming. "But names, like threads, can lead to unexpected places. It might be worth inquiring." She resumed her knitting, her expression serene, but her suggestion hung in the air like a subtle challenge. Craddock nodded, making a note. I'll send a telegram to London. If Vale is involved, we'll soon know." He turned to Clara, whose face had grown even paler. "Miss Henshaw, I trust you'll remain at Gossington Hall for the time being. It would be unfortunate if you left before we could verify your story." Clara murmured her agreement, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of panic. Mrs. Bantry, sensing the tension, offered more tea, though the gesture did little to ease the atmosphere. As the conversation turned to village matters, Miss Marple observed Clara closely. The young woman's hands, now clasped tightly, trembled slightly, and her glances toward the window grew more frequent. It was the behaviour, Miss Marple thought, of someone expecting an interruption or an escape. After Craddock departed, promising to return with any news from London, Mrs. Bantry confided in Miss Marple. "Jane, I'm at my wit's end," she said, her voice low. Clara's story seemed so pitiable at first, but now, those thefts and the way she reacted to the inspector's questions, do you think she could be involved? Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her eyes thoughtful. "It is too early to say, Lavinia, but I have learned that truth often hides behind a mask of distress. We must watch and wait." She paused, then added, "It might be wise to ensure Clara does not leave just yet. A sudden departure could complicate matters." Mrs. Bantry nodded, her resolve firming. "I'll insist she stay until the inspector is satisfied. But oh, Jane, I feel such a fool for letting her in." "Nonsense," Miss Marple said firmly. "You acted with humanity, and that is never foolish. But we must be vigilant. The heart of this mystery lies not in what is said, but in what is left unsaid." As Miss Marple walked home through the gathering dusk, the village quiet but for the distant bark of a dog, she turned over the day's events. Clara's reaction to Craddock's questions, the mention of Roderick Vale, and the timing of the thefts all pointed to a scheme that was both cunning and precarious. She recalled a case from her youth, where a charming young man had used a similar pretext to gain trust, only to orchestrate a burglary. The pattern repeats, she thought, but the players change. With a quiet determination, she resolved to attend Mrs. Bantry's next gathering, where she could observe Clara further, and perhaps catch a glimpse of the truth lurking in the shadows. Chapter 5. The Hidden Truth. The evening sky over Chipping Barnet was heavy with the promise of rain, the clouds gathering like silent conspirators, as Miss Jane Marple sat by her cottage fire, her knitting a steady rhythm against the growing patter of raindrops on the window panes. The events of the past days, the thefts, Clara Henshaw's arrival, and the shadow of Roderick Vale, had woven a tapestry of suspicion that she was determined to unravel. Her mind, sharp and disciplined, turned over the fragments of evidence with the precision of a seamstress stitching a delicate pattern. The scrap of paper bearing Vale's name, Clara's polished yet evasive demeanour, and the timing of the village disturbances all pointed to a scheme far more intricate than a chance encounter with highwaymen. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a note from Mrs. Bantry, delivered by a breathless Mary in a rain-soaked cloak. The note was brief but urgent. Inspector Craddock had returned from London with information about Roderick Vale, and he wished to consult Miss Marple at Gossington Hall that evening. Folding the note carefully, Miss Marple donned her coat and hat, her resolve undeterred by the worsening weather. As she made her way to the hall, the wind tugging at her umbrella, she reflected on the nature of deception. "It is like a badly knitted scarf," she mused. "One loose thread, and the whole thing unravels." At Gossington Hall, the drawing-room was warm and softly lit, a stark contrast to the storm raging outside. Mrs. Bantry greeted Miss Marple with a mixture of relief and anxiety, her hands fluttering as she spoke. "Jane, thank goodness you're here. The inspector arrived an hour ago, and he's been closeted with Clara. She's terribly upset, but I can't tell if it's fear or guilt. What do you make of it?" Miss Marple patted her friend's arm reassuringly. "We shall soon see, Lavinia. Let us hear what the inspector has learned." They joined Inspector Craddock in the library, where Clara sat rigidly in a high-backed chair, her face pale and her eyes fixed on the carpet. Craddock, standing by the fireplace, nodded to Miss Marple, his expression one of guarded excitement. "Miss Marple, your suggestion about Roderick Vale was most astute," he began, his voice crisp with authority. "My colleagues in London have confirmed that Vale is no mere acquaintance of Miss Henshaw. Her real name, it seems, is Eleanor Gray, and she and Vale are known associates in a string of thefts targeting country estates. She poses as a distressed traveller, or a lady in need, gaining entry to homes, while Vale and his confederates carry out the robberies." Clara, or Eleanor, flinched at the revelation, her hands clenching in her lap. "That's a lie!" she cried, her voice trembling but edged with defiance. "I am Clara Henshaw, and I know no such man as Roderick Vale. You've no proof." Craddock produced a telegram from his pocket, his eyes never leaving her. "This arrived from Scotland Yard this afternoon. A witness places you with Vale at a London inn 2 weeks ago, and your description matches that of a woman involved in a theft at a manor in Kent last month. The scrap of paper found in your room, Miss Gray, bears Vale's name and address. Care to explain?" Clara's composure cracked, her breath coming in short gasps. I don't know how that paper came to be there," she stammered. "Someone must have placed it to incriminate me. I swear, I'm innocent." Miss Marple, seated quietly with her knitting, observed the young woman's performance with a detached curiosity. The denial was vehement, but it lacked conviction, like an actor stumbling over lines. She recalled a similar case from years past, where a young woman had used tears and protestations to deflect suspicion, only to be undone by a single careless detail. "Miss Gray," Miss Marple said softly, her voice cutting through the tension, "it is curious, is it not, that you should carry a paper with Mr. Vale's name, yet claim no knowledge of him? People are often betrayed by what they fail to discard." Clara's eyes darted to Miss Marple, a flicker of fear betraying her. Before she could respond, Mrs. Bantry interjected, her voice tinged with distress. "Jane, Inspector, surely there's some mistake. Clara, Eleanor, has been nothing but polite. Could she truly be part of such a scheme?" Craddock's expression softened, but his resolve remained firm. "I'm afraid the evidence is compelling, Mrs. Bantry, but we need more than suspicion to act. Miss Gray, you'll remain here under observation until we can apprehend Vale and confirm your role." Miss Marple, her needles clicking rhythmically, suggested a course of action. "Inspector, might I propose a small gathering tomorrow evening? A few trusted villagers, a simple supper, nothing to alarm Miss Gray. It would provide an opportunity to observe her behaviour, and perhaps to draw out any confederates who may be watching." Craddock's eyes lit with approval. "An excellent idea, Miss Marple. If Vale is nearby, as I suspect, he may show himself if he believes Miss Gray is still unsuspected." He turned to Mrs. Bantry. "Would you be willing to host such an event?" Mrs. Bantry, though shaken, nodded. "Of course, if it will help clear this matter up. But I confess, I feel quite out of my depth." "Nonsense," Miss Marple said gently. "You are doing splendidly, Lavinia. We are merely untangling a knot, and every knot has a weak point." As the storm raged on, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her mind alight with possibilities. The revelation of Clara's true identity as Eleanor Gray confirmed her suspicions, but she sensed the scheme was not yet fully revealed. The thefts in Chipping Barnet, the candelabrum, the mare, were likely diversions designed to keep suspicion away from Gossington Hall. She thought of a case from her youth, where a pair of thieves had used a similar tactic, staging minor crimes to mask their true target. A valuable painting hidden in a country manor. The trick, she mused, is to look where no one else is looking. Settling by her fire, Miss Marple reviewed the facts. Eleanor Gray's polished manners, her vague story, the scrap of paper, and now the connection to Roderick Vale, all pointed to a carefully orchestrated plan. But what was their true aim? The silver and the mare, while valuable, seemed too petty for a scheme that required such risk. She suspected a larger prize, perhaps something within Gossington Hall itself, Mrs. Bantry's emerald brooch, or the collection of antique jewellery she kept locked in a safe. The simplest answer is often the wrong one, Miss Marple thought, her needles pausing. But the truth is always there, waiting to be seen. As the rain drummed against her windows, Miss Marple resolved to attend the supper with a watchful eye. Eleanor Gray, she felt certain, was not the mastermind, but a player in a larger game. Roderick Vale, or someone yet unknown, was pulling the strings, and the gathering at Gossington Hall might just be the stage where the truth stepped into the light. With a quiet smile, she resumed her knitting, her mind as sharp as the needles in her hands, ready to unravel the mystery that had settled over Chipping Barnet. Chapter 6. The trap is set. The storm that had battered Chipping Barnet the previous night had given way to a sullen, grey afternoon, with low clouds casting a pall over the village. Gossington Hall, however, was a hive of quiet preparation, as Mrs. Lavinia Bantry oversaw arrangements for the evening's gathering. The supper, proposed by Miss Jane Marple as a means to observe Eleanor Gray, alias Clara Henshaw, and possibly draw out her accomplice, Roderick Vale, was to be a modest affair. Invitations had been extended to a select few. Dr. Haydock, whose shrewd observations could be relied upon, Mrs. Clements, whose penchant for gossip ensured the event would not go unnoticed, and Mr. Pym, the shopkeeper, whose knowledge of village comings and goings was invaluable. Miss Marple, with her unassuming presence, would be the quiet sentinel, her eyes and ears attuned to the smallest discrepancies. As the clock struck 6, the guests began to arrive, their umbrellas dripping from a fresh drizzle that had begun to fall. Mrs. Bantry, resplendent in a sapphire blue gown, greeted each with her usual warmth, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease as she glanced toward Eleanor, who stood by the drawing-room fireplace. The young woman, dressed in a borrowed dress of soft green that complemented her dark hair, maintained an air of poised gratitude, but Miss Marple noted the tension in her posture, the way her fingers gripped her fan, the quick glances she cast toward the tall windows overlooking the lawn. The dining room, with its polished mahogany table and gleaming candelabra, was a picture of elegance, but the atmosphere was charged with an unspoken anticipation. Inspector Craddock, though not formally invited, had stationed himself discreetly in the library, ready to act should the evening reveal anything untoward. Miss Marple, seated between Dr. Haydock and Mrs. Clements, kept her conversation light, touching on village matters and the merits of autumn roses. But her attention never strayed far from Eleanor. The young woman's laughter, when it came, was a touch too bright. Her responses to questions about her supposed cousin in Gloucestershire, vague and halting. As the soup course was cleared and the main dish of roast pheasant was served, Mrs. Clements leaned forward, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Miss Henshaw," she said, oblivious to the inspector's revelations about Eleanor's true identity, "you must tell us more about your journey. It's positively thrilling to think of you escaping those dreadful highwaymen. Were they very fierce?" Eleanor's smile was strained, but she rallied with a practiced grace. "Oh, quite terrifying, Mrs. Clements. They wore masks, you see, and their voices were rough. I dared not look back as I ran." Her words were smooth, but Miss Marple, her knitting set aside for the evening, noted the slight tremor in her voice, the way her eyes darted to the window as a gust of wind rattled the pane. Dr. Haydock, his gruff manner softened by a glass of claret, joined the conversation. "Sounds like a bad lot," he remarked, "though I'd wager they weren't local. We've not had such trouble in Chipping Barnet since that business with the Grayson coach years ago." His comment was innocent enough, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of alarm in Eleanor's expression, quickly masked by a sip of wine. The meal progressed without incident, but as the dessert, a delicate lemon syllabub, was served, a sudden crash echoed from the library, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Mrs. Bantry gasped, her hand flying to her throat, and the guests turned as one toward the sound. Eleanor's face drained of colour, her fan slipping to the floor. Before anyone could speak, Inspector Craddock burst into the room, his expression grim. "Mrs. Bantry, I'm afraid your emerald brooch is missing from the library safe," he announced, "and there's a broken window. Someone's been on the grounds." Pandemonium ensued. Mrs. Clements let out a small shriek. Mr. Pym leapt to his feet, and Dr. Haydock called for calm. Eleanor rose, her chair scraping against the floor, and murmured something about needing air, but Miss Marple, with a quiet firmness, placed a hand on her arm. "My dear, it would be best if you stayed," she said, her voice gentle but unyielding. "We wouldn't want you caught in the rain, or mistaken for someone fleeing." Eleanor froze, her eyes wide with panic, but she sank back into her seat. Craddock, with a nod to Miss Marple, excused himself to investigate, signalling to a constable who had been waiting outside. Moments later, a commotion from the garden drew the guests to the windows, where they saw Craddock and the constable apprehending a man struggling in the shrubbery. His dark coat and furtive movements matched Mrs. Hargreaves's description of the figure seen near the village green, and when he was brought into the hall, his face lit by the glow of a lantern, Mrs. Bantry gasped. "That's no highwayman. That's the man who came to repair the stables last week." Craddock, his grip firm on the man's arm, confirmed her suspicion. "This is Roderick Vale, known to Scotland Yard for theft and deception. He was attempting to flee with the brooch, no doubt signalled by someone inside." His eyes flicked to Eleanor, who sat rigid, her hands clenched in her lap. Miss Marple, her expression serene but her mind racing, pieced together the final threads. The crash, the broken window, the stolen brooch. It was a calculated move, orchestrated to coincide with the gathering when suspicion would be diffused among the guests. She recalled a similar incident in a neighbouring village, where a thief had used a social event as cover for a robbery, relying on an accomplice within the household to provide access. "It is remarkable," she said softly, almost to herself, "how often people underestimate the power of observation." Turning to Eleanor, Miss Marple's voice was gentle but incisive. "Miss Grey, it must have been difficult to maintain your role under such scrutiny, but a name on a scrap of paper and a glance too many at the window can betray even the cleverest plan." Eleanor's composure shattered. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as Craddock stepped forward. "Eleanor Grey, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit theft," he said, his tone formal but not unkind. To Mrs. Bantry, he added, "I'm sorry for the disturbance, but thanks to Miss Marple's suggestion, we've caught them both." Mrs. Bantry, still reeling, managed a nod. "I never imagined— Oh, Jane, how did you know?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling. "I merely noticed what was there to be seen, Lavinia. Human nature is a predictable thing, if one knows where to look." As the guests dispersed and Eleanor was led away, Miss Marple gathered her shawl, her mind already turning to the quiet of her cottage. The trap had been set, and the truth, as always, had found its way into the light. Chapter 7. The Unravelling. The rain had ceased by morning, leaving Chipping Barnet bathed in a pale, watery sunlight that glistened on the cobblestones and highlighted the orderly charm of Gossington Hall's gardens. Inside the hall, however, the atmosphere was one of subdued shock, as the events of the previous evening's supper lingered like an unwelcome guest. Mrs. Lavinia Bantry, seated in her morning room with a cup of tea growing cold, was grappling with the revelation that her act of kindness had admitted a thief into her home. Miss Jane Marple, invited to join her for breakfast, arrived with her usual punctuality, her tweed coat slightly damp from the walk, and her knitting bag tucked under her arm. Her serene expression belied the keen mind that had orchestrated the unmasking of Eleanor Gray and Roderick Vale. Inspector Craddock, having spent the night ensuring the prisoners were securely detained at the local constabulary, joined them shortly after. His face, though tired, bore the satisfaction of a case nearly closed. "Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple," he began, accepting a cup of tea with a nod, "I owe you both my thanks. Last night's gathering was a stroke of genius. We've recovered the emerald brooch, and I've had word from Scotland Yard that the vicarage candelabrum and Mr. Tompkins' mare have been traced to a stable near London, likely stashed by Vale's accomplices." Mrs. Bantry's relief was palpable, though tinged with lingering dismay. "I'm glad the items are safe, Inspector, but I feel such a fool. To think I welcomed her, Eleanor, I mean, into my home, believing her tale of woe." Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly, offered a gentle smile. "You acted with compassion, Lavinia, and that is never foolish. Deception thrives on trust, but it is the deceiver who bears the fault, not the deceived." Her words, delivered with quiet conviction, eased Mrs. Bantry's self-reproach, though her friend's brow remained furrowed. Craddock, sensing the need for clarity, turned to Eleanor Gray, who had been brought to the morning room under guard for questioning. She sat, pale and diminished, her dark hair pulled back severely, her hands clasped tightly, as if to anchor herself. The defiance of the previous evening had given way to a weary resignation, and when Craddock addressed her, she met his gaze with a flicker of reluctance. "Miss Gray," he said, his tone formal but not harsh, "you've been caught in the act and Mr. Vale is in custody. It will go easier for you if you tell us the truth. What was your purpose at Gossington Hall, and what else have you and Vale planned?" Eleanor hesitated, her eyes darting to Miss Marple, whose steady gaze seemed to pierce through her defences. After a long moment, she sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Very well," she said, her voice low but clear. "My name is Eleanor Gray, as you've discovered. Roderick and we've worked together for some time. It began in London, small thefts to pay debts, but it grew. We targeted country houses, places like this where people are trusting. I'd pose as a lady in distress, gain entry, learn the household's ways. Roderick would follow, taking what we could sell easily, silver, jewellery, livestock." Mrs. Bantry gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "And the highwayman? Was that all a fabrication?" Eleanor nodded, her expression bitter. "A story to explain my arrival. We'd used it before, in Kent and Sussex. It's easy to play the victim when people want to believe you." She glanced at Miss Marple, a trace of resentment in her eyes. "But I didn't expect someone like you. That scrap of paper, I should have burned it. Roderick warned me to be careful, but I thought it was safe." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, though her mind noted the admission. "Carelessness, Miss Gray, is often the undoing of even the cleverest plans," she said softly. "A name, a glance, a moment's oversight, these are the threads that unravel deceit." Craddock pressed further, his notebook open. "And the brooch? Was that your true target? Or was there something more?" Eleanor's lips tightened, but under the weight of scrutiny, she relented. The brooch was Roderick's idea. He'd heard Mrs. Bantry had a collection of jewellery locked in a safe. I was to find its location, signal him during the supper. The candelabrum and the mare were distractions, meant to keep the village looking elsewhere. We planned to take the lot, and be gone to France by week's end. Mrs. Bantry's face flushed with indignation. My mother's emerald brooch! To think you sat at my table, plotting such a thing! Eleanor looked away, her voice barely audible. I'm sorry, it wasn't personal. It was survival. Craddock made a final note, his expression one of professional detachment. You'll have a chance to explain that to a judge, Miss Grey. For now, you and Vale will be taken to London for further questioning. He signalled to the constable, who led Eleanor from the room, her footsteps echoing in the quiet hall. As the door closed, Mrs. Bantry turned to Miss Marple, her eyes wide with admiration. Jane, how did you know? From the start you seemed to see through her. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her smile modest. I knew nothing, Lavinia, but I observed. People reveal themselves in small ways. The turn of a phrase, the flicker of an eye. Miss Grey's story was too polished, her manners too refined for the merchant's daughter she claimed to be. And the paper with Vale's name. It was a thread I could not ignore. I have seen such schemes before, in villages not unlike ours. Human nature, you see, is much the same everywhere. Craddock nodded, his respect for Miss Marple evident. Your instincts were spot on, as always. That suggestion of the supper was what clinched it. Vale might have slipped away if we hadn't drawn him out. Miss Marple waved a hand dismissively. It was merely a matter of creating the right conditions, Inspector. A thief, like a moth, is drawn to the light of opportunity. She paused, her eyes twinkling. And a village, like a web, catches those who move too carelessly. As Craddock took his leave to finalize his report, Mrs. Bantry poured fresh tea, her hands steadier now. Jane, I don't know how I'll ever repay you. You've saved my brooch and my pride. Nonsense, Miss Marple replied, her needles resuming their rhythm. You did what any good heart would do, Lavinia. The fault lies with those who exploit kindness, not with those who offer it. She sipped her tea, her thoughts drifting to the quiet order of her cottage. The mystery was all but solved, but Miss Marple knew that Chipping Barnet, like any village, held countless stories waiting to be unravelled. For now, though, she was content to let the village settle, its peace restored by the simple act of seeing what others overlooked. Chapter 8. The Quiet of Chipping Barnet. The pale October sun cast a gentle glow over Chipping Barnet, its light filtering through the golden leaves that drifted lazily onto the village lanes. Gossington Hall, restored to its customary dignity, stood serene once more, its grey stone walls a testament to the enduring order of country life. Mrs. Lavinia Bantry, though still shaken by the events of the past week, had resumed her role as the village's gracious matriarch, her spirits buoyed by the recovery of her emerald brooch and the swift resolution of the mystery that had briefly upended her home. The vicarage candelabrum was back in its place, polished to a gleam, and Mr. Tompkins's mare, Willow, had been returned to his stable, none the worse for her adventure. The village, ever resilient, had settled back into its quiet rhythms, though the tale of the midnight visitor lingered as a topic of fervent discussion at the Blue Boar Inn and the post office. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her cottage parlour with a view of the garden, was content to let the village chatter fade into the background. Her knitting, a soft grey shawl destined for a niece, progressed steadily, the click of her needles a soothing counterpoint to the ticking of the mantel clock. The events at Gossington Hall had concluded as she had anticipated, with Eleanor Grey and Roderick Vale now in the custody of Scotland Yard, awaiting trial in London. Yet, as was her habit, Miss Marple turned over the details in her mind, not out of doubt, but from a lifelong fascination with the intricacies of human behaviour. Mrs. Bantry called that afternoon, her face bright with gratitude as she settled into a chair by the fire. Jane, I've just had a letter from Inspector Craddock, she announced, producing a neatly folded sheet. He says the case is airtight. Eleanor and Vale have confessed to everything, and they've even implicated a third accomplice, a fence in London who handled their stolen goods. It's all thanks to you." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles, but she shook her head modestly. "Nonsense, Lavinia. I merely pointed out what was there to be seen. The inspector's diligence and your courage in hosting that supper did the rest." She paused, her needles pausing mid-stitch. "Though I confess, I was intrigued by Miss Grey's performance. She played her part well, but she underestimated the power of a village's watchfulness." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her curiosity undimmed. "But how did you know, Jane? From the moment you met her, you seemed to sense something was amiss. Was it the way she spoke, or something else?" Miss Marple considered the question, her gaze drifting to the window where a sparrow flitted among the roses. "It was a combination of things, Lavinia. Her story was too polished, like a tale rehearsed rather than lived. Her manners, though refined, lacked the ease of true breeding. And her eyes, oh, they betrayed her. They were always searching, always wary, as if expecting discovery. And then there was the scrap of paper with Mr. Vale's name. Such a small thing, but it was the loose thread that unravelled the whole." She sipped her tea, her thoughts drifting to a case from her youth, where a young man had posed as a stranded traveller to gain entry to a manor, only to be undone by a forgotten letter. "People are careless with their secrets," she continued, "and villages, for all their quiet, are never truly blind. Mrs. Hargreaves saw a man by the green. Mr. Pym noticed a strange letter. Mary found that paper. It all came together as it always does if one looks closely enough." Mrs. Bantry nodded, her admiration evident. "I shall never open my door to a stranger again without thinking twice," she declared. "Though I suppose I'll never learn to spot what you do, Jane. It's as if you see straight into people's souls." Miss Marple smiled, faintly, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Not their souls, Lavinia, but their habits. People are much the same, whether in Chipping Barnet or London. They betray themselves in the smallest ways. A glance, a word, a moment's hesitation. It is merely a matter of paying attention." As Mrs. Bantry took her leave, promising to invite Miss Marple to a quiet dinner soon, the village settled into the hush of late afternoon. Miss Marple rose to tend her roses, her thoughts lingering on the mystery now concluded. The deception of Eleanor Grey and Roderick Vale had been a clever one, but it had faltered against the quiet vigilance of a community, and the sharp insight of one who understood the patterns of human nature. She clipped a faded bloom, her movements precise, and reflected on the delicate balance of trust and caution. "It is a curious thing," she murmured to herself, "how often the truth hides in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice." With the garden tended, Miss Marple returned to her parlour, the fire casting a warm glow over the room. She picked up her knitting, the soft grey wool sliding through her fingers, and let her mind rest. Chipping Barnet was at peace once more, its secrets laid bare, and its order restored. Yet Miss Marple knew that life, like a skein of yarn, was full of tangles waiting to be unravelled. For now, though, she was content to sit by her fire, her needles moving steadily, ready for whatever mystery might next find its way to her quiet corner of the world.